And I'll turn the floor over now to Charles Goodhart, and we look forward to hearing your contributions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not involved with the wider issues of your framework, which are several, but I'm very much in line with you on the disadvantages of what you describe as the baseline forecast, I describe as a single peak forecast. There are many reasons for this. The first is no one actually knows or can know the future. Not only are our models limited, but the world changes and unforeseen shocks happen from time to time. So one of the problems with a baseline or single peak forecast is it implies much more certainty about what is going to happen than anyone, including particularly the forecasters, actually believe. I have attended many forecasting processes over the last 50 or 60 years, and virtually every single forecast occasion that I've attended, the forecasters have started by saying the current situation is uniquely uncertain. It is always uncertain, maybe a little bit more or a little bit less, but it is always totally uncertain. And having a single peak modal baseline forecast gives an entirely invalid approach to that. Now, Mervyn King actually tried a way of trying to explain some of the difficulties by having a fan chart with a wide range, which varied depending on how uncertain you thought the situation was, and the potentiality for a skew. I'm afraid to say that although I think Mervyn had his heart in the right place, it was a gallant failure. To give one example, when Mervyn left and Mark Carney took over, the fan chart fell into disuse in the UK. During the period when Mark Carney was governor, the range spread of the fan chart was held constant and the skew was always absolutely zero. So it played no part whatsoever. And no one takes very much notice of it. The present chief forecaster of the Bank of England, Hugh Pill, has introduced a skew in recent quarters when the upside risks were much greater than the downside risks, compared with the modal point. But nobody much took any notice of it. There are a whole series of other reasons why I think even with a sort of fan chart skew approach, which has been, I think, a failure, it doesn't really work. The first one is that risks are not simple pairs. You can't, with risks, you can't say that there's a sort of modal outcome. At the next American election, assuming the candidates are now Trump and Biden, you've got the possibility that Trump might become president again or Biden might become president again. You can't get a sort of single forecast by combining a 50% chance of Trump and a 50% chance of Biden. It doesn't really make any sense. So, and many risks are not of the form where you can sort of combine them in any real sense into a single peak forecast. Moreover, the having a single peak baseline forecast puts great emphasis on the deviations of the outcome from the forecasts, rather than the analysis of how the risks have changed in order to drive the forecast, the single peak forecast, out of line. What we're going to have or need to have then is scenarios depending on the perceived risks. One thing that you may not have noted, I didn't see it in any of your discussions, is that when you do these scenarios, you need to have them even numbered, because the Fed and others have frequently, the Fed staff frequently provided to the FOMC 3 forecasts, an optimistic, a middle, and a pessimistic. And inevitably, everybody chooses the middle, and that brings you right back to the single peak forecast. If you have the risk scenarios in even numbers, either X or Y, then there is much less chance of people trying to get back to a single forecast. And if the central bank is sensible and does not give a numerical probability distribution to one risk or the other occurring, it means that everybody, including politicians and journalists, will have to think. Whereas if you actually try to give them numerical probabilities, you will get back almost immediately to the single peak forecast. The problem is that politicians and journalists do not like to think. And the baseline forecast is about as easy to assimilate as anything could be. And if you go into a scenario approach, it means that the politicians and the journalists actually have to think for themselves what the probability of these different risk scenarios might be, and therefore where we might be going. And they may not like that. And one of the concerns that I actually have about your approach is, having done your risk scenarios, what do you then do if the head of government turns around to you and says, well, that's all very fine, but I'd actually like your best estimate, single estimate, of where you think things are going, because it makes it much easier for me. The other advantage which your risk scenario has, which I didn't actually see mentioned again, is that you're focusing on monetary policy. But the central bank nowadays has at least two aspects of its work. It's got to be concerned not only with inflation and monetary policy in the macroeconomic sense, it's also got to be concerned with financial stability. Now, financial stability issues depend entirely on risk scenarios, non-linearities, extreme events of the kind that you mentioned. And if we drive monetary policy into a risk scenario approach, that will tie the monetary policy aspect of the central bank's activity much more closely in with the financial stability aspect of the central bank's what they have to do. And at the moment, a monetary policy committee and a financial stability committee, as we have in the UK, are really rather separate. They look at things in a separate way. They are really rather different kinds of animals, which in some senses I think is a pity. If we appreciate that the key for both monetary policy and financial stability is assessment of what are the likely risks that may play out, the two will be brought back much more closely into a much more harmonious union. And that, I think, would be a great advantage. So for all these reasons, I think that the approach of risk scenarios that you are suggesting for monetary policy is absolutely right. But I must warn you that it makes it much, much more difficult for your readers, the journalists, the politicians, to easily assimilate. And they may turn around and say, well, this is all very fine, but I want something simpler. I just want the basic baseline single peak forecast. What do you do then? Now, that's a question that I don't know the answer to, and I should be interested in how you would deal with such a response.